Hello everyone, in my previous videos I have shown you how to deploy Azure Container Apps using the Azure Portal, CLI and ARM templates. Now in this video I'm going to show you how to create Azure Container Apps using Terraform. And after that I'm going to show you how to create a CICD pipeline for deploying the ACAs described in Terraform using Azure DevOps. So let's get started. Now before going forward, let's try to understand what Terraform Providers are. Now these are basically plugins that act as translation layer that allows Terraform to communicate with many different other services. Now if you look at this diagram here, you write the code using Terraform, and Terraform can work with many different services, and for each service there can be providers. And these providers are written using Golang. They know how to talk to these target APIs. Now this is the official page that lists all the Terraform providers. As you can see, we have AWS, Azure and GCP. It doesn't have to be these cloud service providers. We have Kubernetes, even Docker has a Terraform provider. Now let me stretch the idea of a provider a bit more as an example. Let's say you have an e-commerce system that has an API and this resource-based structure like products and catalogs and things like that. You can write a Terraform provider to deploy these products and catalogs and things like that using Terraform. Now the idea here is that we need a provider to talk to these cloud platforms. Now in our case also we need a provider to talk to Azure. Now if you look at this diagram here, this is what we are going to implement today. As you can see, we have a Terraform script and we are going to write this in a minute, and then we're going to deploy this script to Azure through a Terraform provider. Now if you already worked with Terraform for Azure, you know that Azure RM is the official provider. But since Container Apps is a relatively new service, it does not yet contain the constructs to create an Azure Container App. And because of this, we need to use this AZ API provider. And now let me go back into Terraform Providers page and let me search here AZ API. As you can see, we have the Azure AZ API provider. And if I go into documentation, now as you can see here, this is a very thin layer on top of Azure ARM REST APIs, and this complements the Azure RM, the main provider. And as I said, the problem with Azure RM is that it does not sometimes contain these preview features. But with this provider here, you can use these in preview features. And this provider supports the authentication mechanism that Azure RM provider has. And the key point here that you should understand is that, let me go into the next tab. Now this is the Microsoft documentation for AZ API provider. Let me scroll down a bit. As you can see here, to allow you to manage all Azure resources and features without requiring updates, the AZ API provider includes the following generic. Now this word here is important, generic resources. The resource that we have here is AZ API. With this, you can create any resource in Azure. So I will show you how this works in a minute. And let me scroll down a bit. As I said earlier, this supports the authentication methods as the Azure RM provider. So it is easier for you. And here we have the benefits of using AZ API provider. Now, Azure RM provider, it has the best interface for working with Terraform, but this supports all the Azure features and all the Terraform state fidelity and properties and saved states and all that. And you can convert the code that you've written with AZ API to Azure RM through this migration tool. As you can see, you can use this tool here to migrate scripts to Azure RM. Now that we know what you're going to do today, and also I have told you about the AZ API provider as well and what it does and why that is there, let's go ahead and write some code to deploy our container app to Azure. As you can see, I have this Terraform block added. The first thing that we need to do is we need to specify the providers that we're going to use. For this demo, we need Azure RM provider, as I said earlier, and then I'm going to specify the source and the latest version of Azure RM provider. And then we need AZ API provider as well. And then I'm going to specify the latest version for that as well. The next thing that we should do is, if you're familiar with Terraform, Terraform needs to store this state somewhere so that it can effectively generate the execution plan for deploying our resources. Now, when we run Terraform in our local computer, Terraform will use the local disk to store this state file. But when we run this on Azure DevOps, Terraform should store this state file somewhere. I'm going to use an Azure storage account to store this Terraform state file. I have already created this resource group and the storage account container name as well, and this will be the name of the state file. Now that I have specified the backend as well, let's go ahead and specify the feature blocks. I'm going to keep that empty, and this is how we're going to create our first Terraform resource. We're going to start with resource keyword, and then I'm going to use this resource provided by Azure RM provider. Let me show you that. We have Azure RM, and this has the prefix, this resource has the prefix Azure RM. It's coming from the Azure RM provider. I'm going to reference it with this resource variable here. And now let me specify the name of the resource group and the location. After that, I'm going to create a log analytics workspace. To create an Azure Container App, we need to specify a log analytics workspace. The resource type, as I said earlier, is going to be Azure RM log analytics workspace. Let me specify the name, and the resource group will be the same resource group that I created earlier. This is how I reference it. And the location, I'm going to use the location of the resource group for it. Let's create the Azure Container App environment. Now, for creating the Container Apps environment, we first have to specify the resource. Now, if you look here, AZ API resource, now this resource is coming from the AZ API provider, and this is a generic resource. You will see what I mean in a minute. Now I'm going to call it ACENV, and then I'm going to add the type, parent ID, and that is the resource group, the location, and the name of this environment. After that, this is the interesting thing here. We can specify the body of this resource. To this JSON encode function, we can pass in the ARM template structure. So this is how we're going to do it. As you can see here, we're passing in the JSON of the ARM template. As you can see, I'm passing in all these values. So you're familiar with this because you're familiar with ARM templates. So this is basically an ARM template structure. All right, now let's create the Azure Container App. And here, as you can see, I'm creating this resource, and the resource type, as you can see, is the same as the resource type that I've specified for creating the Container Apps environment. This is a generic resource, and I'm going to call it ACA. Let me just specify the properties as well, the type and the parent and the location and the name of the app, and finally the body. Let me just specify the properties. This is the managed environment ID. I'm specifying the ID of the environment, the Azure Container Apps environment here, and then I want to specify the configuration section, and this should be an external application so that we can see how it works, and the target port is 80. Now this is the template section. This is the revision scope. In this revision scope, I'm going to specify the container. This is going to be a simple Nginx container, and then I'm going to specify the CPU and memory and the scale configuration as well. This will have minimum of 2 replicas and maximum of 20 replicas. Now, as you can see, I have written the Terraform file for deploying our container app. The only thing that you should know about this provider is that this is basically converting the ARM templates into Terraform. So basically, let me show you one other template that I've used in my previous video. If you look here, we have the template, containers, and image, all these properties and scale rules here as well. Now, if I scroll down in the Terraform file, we have the same structure. We're passing in the same ARM template here as well. Now, if I scroll up, now let's try to deploy this Terraform file to Azure to see whether this works. Now let me go into this file, deploy.ps1, and this contains all the commands, all the Terraform commands that we're going to use. You can find these scripts in the description down below if you want to try this out. On the top of the script, I'm creating this service principal. You don't need to do this. You don't need to create a service principal and set up all these environment variables if you have Terraform correctly configured on your machine. And Terraform documentation contains all the scripts. Let's start with Terraform init. Now what this will do is this will download the providers that I've specified into my local machine so that it can invoke them. But before going forward, let me do one little change here, and that is I've specified the backend as Azure RM here. I'm just comment this out because I'm just going to run this script from my local computer. I'm not going to use Azure storage account to store my state files. Now let me save it and go back, and let's try to run Terraform init command. As you can see, it's downloading Azure RM and AZ API providers into your local machine. And if you look here, we have this folder created that will contain all the providers. We have successfully executed init command, and let's try to run plan to see the execution plan for this script. Now let me run it and let me scroll up. If you look over here, we have the Azure Container App getting created and the container environment and the log analytics workspace as well. The plan is to add 4 resources, 0 to change, 0 to destroy, because we don't have anything on Azure yet. And there's one note here as well. You don't use the out option to save this plan, so Terraform can't guarantee to take exactly these actions if you run Terraform Apply now. So what you can do is you can just save this plan specifying the out parameter, and then you can execute that plan. But for this demo, I'm not going to focus on that. Let me just run this apply command so that this will create the resources that we have specified in this file on Azure. So let me just run this file. As you can see, I'm getting updated every 10 seconds until this gets created. Let's go through these commands. We have used Terraform init, plan and apply commands already. Now these are the commands that you need to deploy the resources. You can use Terraform graph command to generate a visual representation of the execution plan. This will be useful if your Terraform file is a really big file. If you're deploying a lot of resources, this might come in handy. Now if you look at the validate command, this will validate the configuration files and you can view the human readable output of the execution plan with show command. And when you run this, if you want to pass in parameters like resource group name or the container app name and things like that, you can provide variable inputs in this manner. You can use Terraform destroy command to clean everything up. Alright, as you can see, the resources are in place. Let me go into Azure portal. Let's refresh my resource group list, and we have the resource group, and inside of that we have the container apps environment, the log analytics workspace, the container app as well. Let me just go into the container app, click on this URL here to see whether the app works. Yes, it does work. Alright, now let me go back. We have completed deploying the Terraform script that we have wrote to Azure. The next thing is creating the CICD pipeline for deploying this script through Azure DevOps. Before doing that, let me just run Terraform destroy to clean up the environment. I'm going to run this command. Alright, as you can see, I have cleaned up my environment. And now let me go into Azure DevOps to create the CI/CD pipeline. Let me open up the browser and let me go into my demo projects organization. Let me just click on this button to create a new project. Let me call it Cool Container App. Alright, I'm going to keep this as private, and then we can use Git. I'm going to create it. The project is in place. If I go into repos and files, I have no files here. Let me just create a new repo. I'm going to name it Cool Container App IAC, and this repo will contain the Terraform files. Let me just create the repository. Alright, now let me add the Terraform file that I've written here in my VS Code. So the easiest way for me to do this is just upload the file from here. I'm just going to click here and click on upload files, and then I can select the file from here. It's this file, main.tf. I'm just going to upload the file. Let me commit it. Alright, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to uncomment this backend block that I have commented earlier, because this time we're going to use this Azure storage account to keep our state files. Let me just commit this. And now let me go into pipelines and create the build pipeline. So basically this will contain only 2 steps. Let me just go ahead and use the classic editor to create the pipeline. I'm going to use Azure repos git. This is the project and this is the repository, and I'm okay with the main branch. I'm going to continue. I'm going to start with an empty job, and then I'm going to add copy files task first, and then I'm going to go into it and I'm going to change the target folder. This will be the target folder. The next step is publishing the files, and for that I'm going to use publish build artifacts task, and here I don't have to do any changes. I'm okay with the default configurations. Now if I go into triggers, I can enable continuous integration. So what this will do is this will automatically trigger this pipeline after making a change in your Terraform file. I'm going to enable the continuous integration, and then I'm going to save and queue this build pipeline. And I'm okay with the default configuration here. I'm just going to save and run it. Let's see whether this runs. I'm going to go into agent job logs. Alright, as you can see, our build pipeline is complete. If I go back, if I go into the artifact, it contains the Terraform file. Now that we have built our build pipeline, let's go ahead and configure a release pipeline for our container app. I'm going to releases and we don't have any release pipelines yet. I'm going to click on new pipeline here, and then I'm just going to start with an empty job. I'm not going to use any template. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to specify the build artifact. This is the project, and I'm going to specify the CI, the build pipeline. This will use the output of that build pipeline for releasing in this release pipeline. Let me just add it, and then I'm going to click on this button to enable continuous deployment as well. Here we can add multiple environments, multiple stages. You can have a dev environment, staging environment, and a production environment. I'm just going to use only one stage here for this demo. I'm going to call it just dev. Alright, now if I go into tasks section, I can configure the task for this release pipeline. The first task that I'm going to add is installing Terraform. For that, let me search Terraform, and here we have the Terraform tool installer. This will install the latest version of Terraform in the release agent that this release pipeline is running on. There's one more thing that I must tell you, and that is when you search for Terraform here, if you don't see these commands, what you can do is you can go into this page and click on this button to get it free. So basically this will add Terraform to your DevOps organization. The next item that I'm going to add is Terraform init. Now if I look into the script that we have executed earlier, the first thing that we should do is init, and then plan, and then apply. Now let me go back into the DevOps portal and click on this button. So basically this is a generic command. What you can do is you can just change this init to plan or apply. Let me just configure the init command first. The first thing that we should configure is the configuration directory. Let me just click on this button and change this. Alright, and as I said earlier, we need to specify a storage account to keep the Terraform state file. For that, I have already created a storage account. Let me show you that. Here we have a resource group. Inside of that resource group, I have this storage account, and inside of that, I have created this container as well. If I go into that container, it is an empty container. Now let me go back and select my Azure subscription. I'm going to go with this subscription here. Now let me just go ahead and select the resource group that contains the storage account. This is the resource group, and I'm going to select the storage account, and this is the container, and I can specify the name of the file. I'm going to go with Terraform TF state, and this file will be created inside of this container. Now I have specified this. Let me just rename it to init. Now let me just clone this task to add the plan stage. Alright, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to plan, and then I'm going to change the command to plan. Now I'm going to change the subscription. I'm going to set the subscription here. That is done. Alright, now the final task that we need to add is the apply task. Let me just create a clone and change the display name, apply, and the command to apply as well. I'm okay with all the other configurations that I have here. Now let me just save the pipeline. Before doing that, let me just rename it. Let me call it Cool Container Apps CD, and I'm going to save the pipeline now. I'm going to go with the root folder. Alright, I have saved the deployment pipeline. Let me just click this button to create a release. As you can see, we have only one environment since that is the only one that we have configured. I'm okay with all these default settings here. I'm just going to click create, and the release one has been created. Let me get into it. As you can see, the deployment is in progress. Let me go into logs. The deployment is in init stage now. Now init is complete. If I go into the Azure portal and the storage account container, let me just refresh it. As you can see, we have the Terraform state file in the container. And if I scroll to the right, it is in the least state. What this means is that Terraform will apply a lock to this file to avoid multiple active deployments. Now let me go back into Azure DevOps, and as you can see, the resources are getting created. As you can see, the deployment is complete now. If I go into Azure portal and resource groups, and if I click refresh, we have the resource group and all the resources. It's functional as well. And now let me do one more thing to see whether our deployment and release pipelines are functioning properly, let me go back into the DevOps portal and let me go into the files, and if I go into the Terraform script, now let me make a change here and let's see whether my CI and CD pipelines are working properly. Let me scroll down and edit, click edit, and then I'm going to change the max replica count. This is 20 and this is too much. I'm going to change this from 20 to let's say 5, and then I'm going to commit it. All right, let me just click commit here. The commit is successful. Now if I go into pipelines, as you can see, the pipeline is in progress. If we go into it, click on this active run. As you can see, the agent job is running and the build pipeline works, and this makes an artifact available for the release pipeline to start. Let me go into releases, and as you can see, it has already started the release 2. So my continuous deployment works as well. Now let me go into it and then click on logs to see how this change gets applied. And now it's in the apply state. If I click on plan to see the logs, if I scroll down, 0 to add, 2 to change, and 0 to destroy. So basically it'll apply only the changes that I made. It's not going to create the whole thing again. Let's wait until this is complete. Alright, as you can see, the release 2 is complete now. If I go into the application and the resource group, and the container app, now if I go into the revision management section. So let me go back into the repos and the files and the Terraform file. And if I scroll down, the change that I made, it is in the revision scope. If you're not familiar with Container Apps revision scopes, please go ahead and watch my video on revisions and you will understand. So basically I made a change in the revision scope. Now if I go into the container app again and change the revision mode to multiple and click on this button to show inactive revisions, as you can see here, I have 2 revisions. The change that you made to the revision scope creates new revisions. Now that's what I wanted to show you, and if I click on the active revision and scale, as you can see, we have 5 replicas as the max count. What this means is that the change that I made has been successfully applied to the container app. Alright, now this is the end of this video. In this video, I wanted to show you how to create Azure Container Apps using Terraform. And after that, I've shown you how to deploy these scripts, the Terraform scripts using Azure DevOps to Azure. If you have further questions or comments, please let me know down below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you learned something new today. I will see you with another video like this soon, and thanks for watching.